Get this beggar out of here before he embarrasses the whole lot of us. Hunter Voss took the paper cup from Daniel Marsh's hand and tipped it onto the concrete, slow enough that everyone could watch. The coffee pooled around Daniel's boot. The afternoon sun was flat and white overhead, and the 23 bikers in the lot had drifted in close enough to block the pumps and the road out. Daniel's beat-up Kawasaki sat behind him, the scratched tank dull under the canopy lights. Hunter leaned in. Daniel could smell cigarette smoke and cheap beer on him. You ride into Harlan County on that sad excuse for a bike, wearing those sad excuse for clothes, acting like you belong here. You don't. Now move before I decide your manners need correcting. Daniel didn't answer. He looked at the spilled coffee, then up at Hunter, jaw set. Anyone paying attention would have read his face and backed off. Nobody in that lot was paying attention. What none of them knew was that 20 minutes up the highway, 40 motorcycles were riding in tight formation, waiting on a word from him. Welcome to Frost Folktales, where we tell stories about people who got written off and didn't stay quiet about it. If that's your thing, subscribe. The afternoon had started the way most of his afternoons started. He'd been on the road since 6 that morning, watching the highway feed under him in long gray ribbons, the wind flat on his chest, the Kawasaki steady. He had on an olive green Henley with the sleeves pushed up, faded jeans gone dusty at the knees, and boots that had been resoled twice because he didn't throw things away while they still worked. His vest sat over the Henley, black and worn, the patches on it earned across decades. He'd pulled into the station because the coffee sign in the window had looked good through a visor at 60 miles an hour. That was the whole reason. A cup of coffee and 20 minutes of sitting still before the next stretch. Harlan County Fuel and Stop sat at the junction of State Route 9 and Old Mill Road. A low building, 2 pump canopies, fluorescent lights spilling across cracked concrete, even though the sky was wide open and blue. The chrome on 23 motorcycles caught that light and threw it back off vests and belt buckles and mirrored sunglasses. Daniel had clocked them coming in. You ride alone across open country long enough, you start cataloging a room without making a show of it. 23 bikes. Harlan Reapers patch on the vest of the man who was obviously running the group. The drift of the others toward his lane. The second he stopped at pump 3, he got his coffee anyway. He stood at the pump with the cup warm in his hand and took 4 sips before Hunter Voss walked over. Hunter was big across the shoulders, with a build that had been muscle once and had gone soft around the edges. Black leather vest over a white long-sleeve shirt, cargo pants tucked into heavy boots, president's patch on his chest, blonde hair going gray at the temples. He had the easy posture of a man used to people stepping out of his way. His crew spread out behind him. He didn't say anything first. He just reached out and took the cup. He poured it slow, so everyone could see. The coffee hit the concrete with a small flat sound and spread in a thin dark pool that reached Daniel's boot and curled around the toe. A couple of the Reapers laughed. One of them made a noise that was less a laugh than a signal, telling Hunter the room was with him. Daniel looked down at the coffee. Hunter's hand was still tilted, making sure the last drop fell. The canopy light hit the puddle and turned it the color of dark glass. Daniel's boot didn't move. Hunter straightened up. You ride into Harlan County on that sad excuse for a bike, wearing those sad excuse for clothes, acting like you belong here. He liked the sound of his own voice, and it showed. You don't belong here. This is our county. These are our roads. And that pump, he said, gesturing with the empty cup before he dropped it on the concrete, is one I intend to use today. So you're going to take that scratched up machine and you're going to walk it down that road, and you're not going to stop until you're out of Harlan County entirely. You understand me? The cup landed by Daniel's foot. No sound. Daniel said nothing. He did not look at the cup. He did not look at the 23 men arranged in the shoulder-to-shoulder semicircle behind Hunter, chrome and leather catching every angle of the overhead light. The group energy doing what group energy always does, feeding itself, growing louder in the absence of opposition, mistaking silence for submission. He did not look at any of that. He looked at Hunter Voss. His eyes were calm, not the calm of a man suppressing something, not the tight, fragile calm of fear dressed up as composure. Something older than that. Something that had been tested in conditions that would reduce most rooms to rubble and had come out the other side not hard, but still, settled. The way bedrock is settled, not because nothing has ever moved against it, but because enough has. Two of the Reapers near the back of the semicircle caught it. Not the smirkers, not the ones performing for each other, but two of the older ones, the ones who had been around long enough to know that a man's stillness tells you more about him than any noise he makes. They caught it, and they said nothing, but they did not laugh again either, and there was a half-step back in one of them that had nothing to do with the physical crowd and everything to do with something they could not name. Hunter did not catch it. Hunter was watching for flinching, and there was none, and he interpreted the absence of flinching as something he could fill with more pressure. He leaned in again. Last time I'll say it. Get out of Harlan County. Right now, Daniel's eyes did not change. The afternoon sun was direct and absolute above the canopy. The fluorescent lights added their cold white layer on top of it, washing every face in the kind of light that hides nothing. Hunter Voss's expression was readable as a billboard. Contempt built on the scaffolding of an audience, arrogance that required witnesses to stay standing. The crew behind him was a sound system, amplifying whatever frequency Hunter broadcast, and Daniel Marsh stood in the center of it like a man who had already calculated the weather and dressed for it. Inside the gas station, a woman in an orange polo shirt was watching through the window. Her hand had moved toward her phone and stayed there, hovering, the way a person's hand does when they have made a decision but have not yet committed to the weight of it. At the far end of the lot, a pickup truck had pulled slowly to the last pump and stopped. The driver had gotten out, glanced toward pump 3, and had not moved since. None of this registered with Hunter Voss. His 23 men were with him. The stranger was alone. The math was the only math that existed in Hunter's world, and it always came out the same way. What Hunter Voss could not see, could not hear, could not calculate in any version of the math he ran, was the slow pulse of vibration against Daniel Marsh's left thigh. The phone was deep in his vest pocket, tucked against his ribs, and it was buzzing with the particular rhythm of a man's second in command checking in. Daniel felt it, the way you feel something you have been waiting for without looking like you are waiting. A small acknowledgement, a quiet confirmation that the world he actually lived in was still moving on schedule. 20 minutes up the highway, riding in tight double column, spaced with the precision of men who had learned formation, in places where the spacing between you and the man beside you meant the difference between going home and not. 40 motorcycles were rolling south toward Harlan County. Their engines were a low thunder, at the edge of hearing if you knew what to listen for. No one in that lot knew what to listen for. 40 riders, one frequency, one destination, and every single one of them was waiting on a single word from the quiet man standing in spilled coffee at pump 3 with the calmest eyes in the county. Daniel had not sent that word yet. He had not decided he needed to. He looked at Hunter Voss, at the cup on the ground, at the semicircle of chrome and leather holding the afternoon light, and something in his expression settled another degree deeper into itself. He was a patient man. He could wait. Hunter Voss had not always been the kind of man who poured out another man's coffee. He had learned it, practiced it, the way other men practiced a golf swing or a firm handshake, until the cruelty came out smooth and natural and looked, to the untrained eye, like confidence. 11 years. That was how long Hunter Voss had owned these roads. Not on paper. On paper, Harlan County belonged to the state, to the county commission, to the grid of property tax records and deed filings, that accumulated dust in the courthouse on Franklin Street. But paper was for people who needed permission. Hunter Voss had never needed permission for anything in Harlan County, and 11 years of no one pushing back had calcified that truth inside him until it felt like bone. He remembered the first gas station owner who had asked him and his crew to move along. A retired man, Korean, thick glasses, who had come outside with a broom handle and told them in careful English that they were blocking his pumps. Hunter Voss had looked at the man for a long time without speaking, not threatening, just looking. The silence had done the work. The man had gone back inside, and the Reapers had stayed another 40 minutes, and Hunter Voss had paid for nothing, and that was the last time anyone at that particular station had asked them to move. Word traveled in a county this size. It traveled between gas stations and diners, between truckers and dispatchers, between the woman who cut hair on Route 9 and her customers who hauled freight and stopped in every Tuesday. The word was simple: give the Reapers space. Now Hunter Voss circled the Kawasaki parked at Pump 3, and his boots scraped the concrete in an easy rhythm, and his crew watched him the way they always watched him when he was performing, which was most of the time. The bike was a middleweight, an older model, the finish worn down to something that was closer to gray than the original black it must have been. The left mirror had a crack running diagonally across the glass, so that whatever the rider saw in it came back to him in two separate pieces. One of the saddlebags was secured with a replacement strap that didn't match the hardware on the other side, a brown leather band against chrome-tone buckles that belonged to a different set entirely. Small things. The kind of small things a man noticed when he was building a case. "Look at this," Hunter Voss said, not to anyone in particular, which meant to all 23 of them at once. He tapped the cracked mirror with one knuckle. "Man's riding around with a funhouse mirror. How do you even know what's behind you?" Someone laughed. Several someones. The energy in the semicircle shifted the way it always shifted when Hunter Voss found his angle. A little looser, a little meaner, the way a dog pack settles when the lead dogs found the scent. Trace Dunbar stood at Hunter Voss's right shoulder. That was where Trace always stood. Not quite even with him, always half a step back, which was a position Trace had found in the first year and never surrendered, because it was the only position that worked, close enough to the warmth to benefit from it, far enough back to deny complicity if the warmth ever turned to fire. He fed a low sound of agreement into the air now, something between a laugh and a grunt, the social currency of a man whose job was to amplify without originating. Hunter Voss crouched beside the rear saddlebag, examining the mismatched strap with theatrical interest. He shook his head slowly. "This is a man who fixes things with whatever he finds in the parking lot." He stood and looked at Daniel Marsh directly. "That what happened? Something break down and you just grabbed whatever was nearby?" Daniel Marsh said nothing. That was the part Hunter Voss had not fully processed yet. He was accustomed to silence from people he intimidated. But there were varieties of silence, and they were not all the same. There was the silence of fear, tight, held in, accompanied by eyes that wouldn't meet his, and hands that found things to do to demonstrate harmlessness. There was the silence of calculation, nervous, the eyes moving, measuring exits. And then there was this other silence, the one coming off Daniel Marsh like heat off blacktop in July, which was something Hunter Voss did not have a clean category for, and therefore filed under stubbornness, because stubbornness was something you broke. Hunter Voss moved to the tank. He bent forward slightly, scanning the surface with the bored curiosity of a man inspecting damaged merchandise at a yard sale. The scratches in the paint were numerous and varied in age, the older ones buffed into the finish, the newer ones still catching the flat white light from the canopy overhead. And there, just below the left side of the handlebars, was a small rectangular sticker. Black background, a simple design, a set of wings flanking a shield, text too small to read comfortably from standing height. Hunter Voss squinted at it for a moment. Then he flicked it with the nail of his index finger. One sharp snap of contact, dismissive, the way you'd flick a leaf off a windshield. "What's this supposed to be?" he said, the question carrying the tone of a man who considered the answer irrelevant before he'd asked it. Daniel Marsh's eyes moved from Hunter Voss's face to the sticker and back. That was all. His hands remained at his sides. Inside the gas station, through the full-length window that ran along the front of the building, Rochelle Moss watched. She had worked this station for 9 years. She had seen the Reapers come through before. Most recently 2 months ago, when 3 of them had filled up and left without paying, and the owner had told her not to call it in because the paperwork wasn't worth the risk. She had filed that away in the same internal drawer where she kept all the things she had witnessed in this county and been told, implicitly or directly, to let go of. Her orange polo shirt was tucked neatly into black slacks, the small station logo embroidered above her left breast pocket. She stood behind the counter with one hand resting on the surface near the register, and her eyes tracking every movement in the lot. The circle of men, the bike, the way the big man in the olive green shirt stood perfectly still at the center of it, not moving, not speaking, not doing any of the things a frightened man would do. Her hand moved toward her phone. She didn't pick it up yet. She turned the situation over in her mind, the way you turn a decision over when you know what you're going to do but you're still working up to the doing of it. At the far pump, a pickup truck rolled in and stopped. Gerald Whitman cut his engine. He had been retired from the county sheriff's office for 3 years. And in those 3 years he had made a sustained effort to stop reading situations the way a law enforcement officer reads them, because his wife had told him it was making him tightly wound at dinner parties. The effort had not entirely taken. He looked at the semicircle of leather vests and the single man at the center of it, and his hand on the door handle paused before he opened it, and he sat in his truck cab for a moment and took inventory. 23 men. 1 man. The 1 man was not trying to leave. Gerald Whitman got out of his truck slowly and began filling his tank, keeping his body angled so that the situation at Pump 3 remained in his sightline. Hunter Voss had moved back from the bike now and was speaking again, this time ranging more freely, his commentary shifting from the Kawasaki to the road itself, to the nature of passing through, to what a man reveals about himself by what he rides and how he maintains it. It was the kind of talk that sounded casual and wasn't. It was architecture. It was the construction of a public case for why the man standing at Pump 3 was lesser, smaller, not worth the air he was breathing in Harlan County. 23 pairs of eyes rested on Daniel Marsh to see if the architecture was landing. Daniel Marsh was not looking at Hunter Voss anymore. He was looking at a place just past Hunter Voss's left shoulder, the kind of unfocused middle distance that a man looks at when he is inside a thought the people around him cannot see. His breathing was even. His shoulders were down and level. He had the physical bearing of a man who had spent years in conditions that redefined the word uncomfortable, and who carried those years now as a kind of permanent calibration. A body that knew the difference between this and genuinely bad and had quietly categorized this. 3 tours, 2 of them in places where the air itself was the threat, where the discipline of stillness was not a personality trait but a survival requirement that you practiced until it was no longer a practice but the only mode you knew. He had come home from those places carrying things that didn't fit in bags. He had found brothers who carried the same things. He had helped build something from that shared weight. The road had been his since the day he'd thrown a leg over his first bike in the parking lot of the VA Center in Baltimore. 17 years ago, his discharge papers still smelling like the printer. The road had no owner. He had known that the first time the engine turned over and the horizon opened up ahead of him, and he had known it every mile since. He checked his watch. The face caught the overhead fluorescent light, and gave back a clean read. 19 minutes. Hunter Voss was still talking. The crew was still watching. The sticker on the tank, small, black, winged, sat exactly where it had always sat, undisturbed by the flick of one finger, adhered to the metal with the same quiet permanence as everything else Daniel Marsh carried. Hunter Voss did not know what it meant. That was all right. He would. The afternoon sun had not moved. It still pressed down through the open sky above the gas station canopy, and the overhead fluorescent panels still flooded Pump 3 in that flat, unforgiving white light that showed everything, every crease in Hunter Voss's leather vest, every chrome scuff on the Reapers' parked bikes, and every quiet line on Daniel Marsh's face as he stood with both feet planted on the cracked concrete. Nothing had changed in the geometry of the moment. 23 men still formed that loose shoulder-to-shoulder crescent. Hunter Voss still occupied the center of it, like a man who had rehearsed standing in the middle of things his whole life. But something had shifted in the atmosphere, the way a room shifts when someone in it knows something no one else does. Hunter Voss felt the shift without being able to name it. And men like Hunter Voss respond to what they cannot name by reaching for something louder. He turned toward Daniel Marsh's Kawasaki, the way a man turns toward a prop, something to handle, something to perform with. His eyes moved along the bike's scratched frame, down to the mismatched saddlebag strap he'd already noted and cataloged and filed away as evidence of a man without resources. The saddlebag itself was old, dark brown leather, worn soft at the corners, the buckle tarnished to a dull brass. It sat flat against the rear of the bike, patient and closed, carrying whatever it carried in the same quiet way its owner was carrying himself. Hunter Voss smiled at it. He looked back at his crew, and the smile widened into something performative, a comedian locating his audience before delivering the line. "You know what I'm curious about?" He let the pause sit. Several Reapers leaned in instinctively. "Let's see what the beggar's carrying. Maybe some loose change. Maybe a sandwich from 3 days ago." The laughter came fast and accommodating, the kind a crowd produces when the person laughing loudest is also the most dangerous person in the circle. Hunter Voss stepped toward the saddlebag. He didn't reach for the buckle. Not yet. He placed one hand on the leather and pressed down, slow and deliberate, feeling its contents the way a man might feel a package he has every intention of opening. It was the most physical violation that had occurred in the last 6 minutes. And it was also the one that finally drew Daniel Marsh's hand. He placed his palm flat on the saddlebag, not grabbing, not pushing, flat, a hand that had held rifles and folded flags and steadied injured men in the dark of places no gas station in Harlan County had ever heard of. The hand of a man who understood the weight of what he was covering. When Daniel Marsh spoke, it was the first time in the story that he had. His voice was low. It was measured the way that only years of measured choices produce. There was no threat threaded through it, no performance, no shake of adrenaline, no need to be heard beyond the few feet between himself and Hunter Voss. "I'd leave that alone." 5 words. The crowd heard them as a joke and laughed on reflex. Hunter Voss grinned and took his hand off the bag, stepping back with the satisfied posture of a man who believes he has just demonstrated patience rather than been stopped. But at the back of the crescent, 2 of the older Reapers did not laugh. They were men in their 50s, men who had been riding long enough to have seen a few things, and they exchanged a look that lasted less than 2 seconds. It communicated something they did not say aloud, that the man at Pump 3 was not what Hunter Voss was calling him. They didn't know exactly what he was, but they knew that much. Inside the saddlebag. And this is not something Hunter Voss would learn today, not something the fluorescent canopy lights would ever illuminate for him. There were the ordinary things a long-distance rider carries: tools, a spare strap, a waterproofed map folded against a charging cable, There was a small zippered sleeve of medication, because the body that had carried Daniel Marsh through 3 combat tours had extracted certain dues over time, and Daniel Marsh honored that debt without complaint. There was a worn paperback with the spine cracked at 3 different chapters, and folded in a square of clean white cloth, placed at the bottom of the bag with the deliberateness of an altar object, was a flag, not a decorative flag, not a flag anyone had purchased at a roadside shop or ordered from an online catalog. This was a flag that had been folded by hands other than Daniel Marsh's at a funeral he had attended 17 years ago for a man named Corporal Raymond Lee Pickens, 24 years old, from Mobile, Alabama, who had been in Daniel Marsh's unit during his 2nd tour and who had not come home with the rest of them. The flag had been placed in Daniel Marsh's hands by a woman in a black dress who did not stop crying. Daniel Marsh had told her he would carry it. He had been carrying it since. Beside the flag, in a small envelope worn soft at the edges, was a photograph. Black and white, printed from a scan of the original. 11 men in uniform, squinting into a desert sun, shoulders pressed together in the particular way that men press together when they have survived something by deciding, each one of them, that no one else in the picture was allowed to die. Daniel Marsh stood second from the left. He was 29 years old in that photograph. He was smiling in it, which was notable because Daniel Marsh was not a man who smiled easily, and the smile meant something specific about the company he was in. 3 of the 11 men in that photograph had not made it back. The ones who did come home found a country that greeted them with paperwork and a handshake and a polite but firm suggestion that the table was full. That was where the Iron Brotherhood was born, not in a bar, not in a moment of rebellion, but in a VA waiting room in 2003, where Daniel Marsh and 6 other black veterans sat in plastic chairs for 4 hours and talked about what they had come home to find. They talked about the clubs that didn't want them, the rooms that went quiet when they walked in wearing their patches, the brothers in arms who were welcomed somewhere that these men were not. They talked about it without performance, without anger made loud, the way men talk about a thing they've already decided to answer rather than simply survive. The Iron Brotherhood Veterans MC was incorporated in the state of Virginia 8 months later. By the time Daniel Marsh became national president, 12 years into its existence, there were 47 active members across 6 chapters, every one of them a veteran, most of them men who had done multiple tours, all of them men who had chosen to build something rather than wait for someone else to build it for them. The annual cross-country memorial run had become what they called the spine of the organization, a 1,000-mile ride each year, along a route that passed through towns where their members had grown up, pausing at cemeteries, at walls, at small roadside markers that most passing drivers never slowed down to read. This year, as in every year, Daniel Marsh rode it alone for the first day. It was not a rule, it was a ritual. He needed that first stretch of highway to himself, to carry the flag and the photograph without having to be anyone's president or anyone's brother or anyone's anything. Just a man on a road, accounting for what he had been part of. He was 18 minutes into Hunter Voss's county when he had stopped for coffee near the edge of the Reapers Crescent. Petra Voss had gone quiet. She had arrived at the gas station an hour before with her brother, pulled up on the back of Trace Dunbar's bike, standing slightly apart from the crew in the way that people who belong to something by proximity rather than conviction always stand slightly apart. She wore a yellow jacket, unzipped, over a white shirt and dark jeans, her hair pulled back, and she had watched the whole sequence of events with an expression that had begun as the familiar weary tolerance of someone who has witnessed this behavior too many times to be surprised by it. But something about those 5 words had changed her expression into something less settled. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out her phone. She opened the camera. She pressed record. And here was the thing that made it significant. The thing that separated her from every other phone in that circle. Her face, visible above the screen, did not look proud. She did not look entertained. She looked like a woman documenting something she did not know yet how to name, but understood instinctively she needed evidence of. Her brother was still performing for the crew, still feeding off the energy of 23 men who laughed when he did, and Petra Voss was recording all of it with an expression that was already beginning to mourn what he was making of himself. Inside the gas station, behind a window that gave a clear sightline to Pump 3, Rochelle Moss had stopped pretending to organize the counter display. She was a woman in her 40s who had worked at this station for 11 years and had watched the Reapers move through this county like weather, unavoidable, impersonal, costly to stand in the path of. She had her phone in her hand. She had already pulled up the county dispatch number, and as she watched Daniel Marsh stand with his palm flat against that saddlebag, as she watched his stillness hold in a way that made the 23 men around him seem somehow smaller than they had before, she pressed send. The text reached the dispatcher's screen at 3:47 in the afternoon, under a sky that was still bright and open and flooding the lot in the kind of light that showed everything clearly. Daniel Marsh checked his watch. He did not look at the highway. He did not need to. 17 minutes. There is a particular kind of silence that exists just before a man decides he has run out of patience with civility. Hunter Voss had been standing in that silence for several minutes now, working through it, turning it over like a stone he couldn't quite crack. He had poured out Daniel Marsh's coffee. He had circled the man's bike. He had narrated every scratch and dent on that Kawasaki like a carnival barker, reading the flaws of a broken-down exhibit. He had filled the afternoon air with laughter that his crew obediently delivered on cue. And through all of it, Daniel Marsh had done nothing, said almost nothing, stood there beside Pump 3 with his worn olive green Henley and his faded dark blue jeans and his dusty road boots, and had simply refused to become afraid. That refusal, Hunter Voss had decided, was its own kind of disrespect. Maybe the deepest kind. The afternoon sun was still blazing directly overhead, pressing down through the open sides of the gas station canopy, the fluorescent overhead lights layering bright and flat across the concrete. There were no shadows to hide in here. Everything was visible. Everyone was lit. Hunter Voss preferred it that way, usually. Visibility meant witnesses to his authority. Today the light was starting to feel like something else. He pushed the feeling aside. He turned to the two Reapers standing nearest to Daniel Marsh's bike. Their names were Cody and Dex. Younger members, the kind who were still collecting their status in the crew by being first to do what Hunter Voss wanted. Hunter Voss tilted his head toward the Kawasaki. His meaning was perfectly clear without a single word. Move it. Cody and Dex exchanged a glance. It lasted less than a full second. Half a beat, maybe. Just long enough for anyone watching closely to notice that the instruction had arrived in their minds slightly before their bodies were willing to follow it. Then they walked to the bike. Cody took the handlebars. Dex positioned himself at the rear frame. Together they wheeled Daniel Marsh's Kawasaki away from Pump 3, rolling it several yards across the cracked concrete until it sat marooned in the open lot, away from the pump, away from where Daniel Marsh had parked it with quiet intention 20 minutes ago. Daniel Marsh watched his bike move. He did not step forward. He did not reach out. His jaw did not tighten, and his hands did not curl, and his eyes did not flash with the kind of visible anger that Hunter Voss was hunting for. He watched the Kawasaki roll away from him the same way a man might watch rain cross a window. Present, aware, entirely unmoved in the way that matters. The bike stopped. Cody and Dex stepped back. The space between Daniel Marsh and his motorcycle was now measurable in yards. A small manufactured distance that was meant to carry a message. The message was, "Nothing here belongs to you." Hunter Voss spread his arms slightly, a performer acknowledging the room. Several Reapers laughed. A few offered sounds of approval, short, bark-like, the vocal equivalent of applause from men who had rehearsed this routine across 11 years of Harlan County roads. Hunter Voss read the moment as victory and wore it immediately, the way he always did, like a coat he'd already owned. He rolled his shoulders. He let the silence confirm itself. At the far pump, Gerald Whitman had not moved from beside his pickup truck. He was 68 years old, and he had spent 22 of those years as county sheriff before his retirement. And in that time, he had developed the particular skill of watching a situation without appearing to watch it. His blue jacket was zipped to the middle of his chest. His hands were in his pockets. His phone was no longer in his pocket because he had already removed it, already scrolled to a contact he had not needed in 3 years, and already spoken into it in the low, flat voice of a man reporting facts. He had given the location. He had described what he'd observed. He had used specific language, encirclement, property moved without consent, pattern consistent with prior Reaper incidents, because 22 years had taught him that specific language produced specific responses. He ended the call and slid the phone back into his jacket and returned his hands to his pockets and went on watching without appearing to watch. Now the camera of this story lifts. It rises up through the canopy light and the afternoon glare and climbs above Harlan County entirely, traveling north and west along the highway that feeds into this county from the open terrain beyond it. Because 20 minutes up that road, something is happening that Hunter Voss cannot see or hear or imagine. 40 motorcycles are running in double column formation. The spacing between each bike is precise, not approximate, not roughly maintained, but precise in the way that men with military backgrounds understand precision. The columns are mirror images of each other, rolling at a steady 70 miles per hour. The gap between riders calibrated to the 10th of a second at that speed. Iron Brotherhood colors cover 40 backs, black leather cut, white lettering, the Brotherhood's national chapter patch centered and clear. Below the main patch, veteran insignia, branch designations, tour patches, service ribbons rendered in embroidered thread that had earned the right to exist on those vests through specific years in specific places that do not appear on any tourist map. Jerome Tate rides point. He is broad across the shoulders in the way that men become broad when they have carried weight, real weight, the kind that doesn't come from a gym, for extended periods of time. His orange top is visible beneath his open leather vest, and the blue jacket folded across his rear bag is pressed flat against the wind. His eyes are straight ahead. He has been in point position for 8 years, and he holds the formation's pace with the steadiness of a man who understands that every rider behind him is trusting his judgment with their lives. Behind him, 39 bikes respond to his speed with the slight, constant micro-adjustments of experienced riders who have ridden together long enough that the formation breathes like a single organism. Winston Gable is riding 6th in the left column. He is the Brotherhood's road captain, and the radio mounted to his handlebars connects him to a small earpiece that sits in his left ear. He has been checking the GPS interval every 3 minutes for the last half hour. He checks it now, 16 minutes. He keys the radio once. A short click, a signal that carries a specific meaning inside the Brotherhood's protocol. It means we are on schedule. It means nothing has changed. It means hold formation and trust the road captain and trust the national president who is somewhere ahead of us at a gas station in Harlan County, standing beside his Kawasaki, holding a silence that Winston Gable has seen the man hold before, under conditions that made this look like a Sunday ride. He releases the key. The wind takes the sound of 40 engines and spreads it across the open terrain in a low, continuous thunder that any experienced rider would recognize from a mile away if there were any experienced riders in the path to hear it. There are not yet. Back at the gas station, Hunter Voss has lit a cigarette. He leans against the pump housing with the specific posture of a man who believes he owns the ground beneath his boots, the smoke moving straight up in the still afternoon air under the canopy lights. He lets the cigarette establish itself. He lets the moment breathe. Then he looks at Daniel Marsh with an expression that contains no heat, only the flat administrative quality of a man issuing a final notice. He tells Daniel Marsh that this is the last time he's going to say it, that Daniel Marsh should walk over to that sad bike of his and push it down the road and not come back to Harlan County. He says it without raising his voice. He has learned, over 11 years, that quiet delivery makes a threat carry further. He says Daniel Marsh looks like a man who has spent his whole life being in the wrong place, and Harlan County is just the latest wrong place. And the kindest thing Hunter Voss can do for him is let him leave with his dignity intact, such as it is. Several Reapers nodded at this. Trace Dunbar offered something that was halfway between a laugh and an affirmation. Though anyone watching closely would have noticed, the sound arrived a fraction late, like an echo from a wall that was slightly farther away than it appeared. Daniel Marsh said nothing. He looked at his watch. The watch was plain, analog, with a scratched crystal face that had taken its damage across several decades of being worn by a man who used his hands in conditions where instruments were not protected. He looked at it the way a man looks at a clock when he already knows what time it is, not for information, but for confirmation. His eyes stayed on it for 3 full seconds. Then he lifted his gaze. He looked toward the highway. From Pump 3, with the right angle and the afternoon light coming down clean and direct, you could see the entrance ramp where the highway fed into the county road that ran past this gas station. You could see the point where the elevated section of highway met the sky. Daniel Marsh looked at that point for a long moment. His eyes were still and focused, the way a man looks at a horizon when he is calculating distance and time and knows the math works out in his favor. And then, for the first time in this story, in 4 chapters of stillness and silence and the kind of patience that most men cannot sustain for 4 minutes, let alone 4 chapters, something changed in Daniel Marsh's face. It was not a smile, exactly. It was the beginning of one. The small, private motion that precedes a smile when a man doesn't want to show the full thing yet because the full thing is for a moment that hasn't quite arrived. The corners of his mouth moved. His eyes changed quality, losing the flat, watchful steadiness and gaining something warmer. Something that in another setting you would simply call anticipation. Hunter Voss saw none of this because Hunter Voss was not watching the man he had spent the last 20 minutes trying to break. He was performing for his crew, scanning their faces for the confirmation that fed him. Daniel Marsh looked back at his watch. 16 minutes had just become something less than 16 minutes. And the highway entrance ramp was exactly as visible as it had been a moment ago. And the afternoon sun was still blazing clean and flat over everything. And Daniel Marsh let the beginning of that smile settle quietly back into stillness. He could afford to wait. It started as a feeling before it became a sound. That is the only way to describe it. And Rochelle Moss, watching from behind the gas station window, with her phone pressed flat against her sternum, would say exactly that to the state police later that evening. A feeling, a low, subterranean vibration that traveled up through the cracked concrete of the lot, through the soles of her work shoes, into the bones of her feet. She felt it before she heard it, and she heard it before anyone outside did, because outside, the Harlan Reapers were still laughing. Hunter Voss was mid-sentence. Something about Daniel Marsh pushing his bike down the county road like a man too broke to call a tow truck. His crew gave him the laughter he was looking for. 23 men arranged in a loose, self-satisfied mass across the sun-blasted lot, the overhead canopy lights pouring flat white down on all of them, the afternoon sun pressing in from the south at a hard angle that made the chrome on 30 bikes blaze like signal mirrors. Hunter had one boot up on the concrete island beside Pump 2. He was comfortable. He had decided this was finished. Daniel Marsh stood beside Pump 3, or rather, beside the space where Pump 3 was, because his Kawasaki was no longer there. It had been wheeled 12 feet to the left by 2 Reapers who had hesitated half a beat before obeying, that hesitation living now in the air like something no one had acknowledged and no one had forgotten. Daniel had watched it move without altering his expression by a single degree. He checked his watch. Then he looked toward the highway entrance ramp, visible from the station's eastern edge, a gray ribbon of road that crested a low hill and disappeared behind a stand of dry pines. Then, barely, at the corner of his mouth, something that was not quite a smile, but was the thought that precedes one. Hunter Voss did not see it. Then the sound arrived. It was rhythmic. That was the first word that attached itself to it. Rhythmic. Like something mechanical being performed with the precision of music. A low-end throb that doubled and then doubled again. The kind of sound that does not fade as it approaches but instead deepens and multiplies, each layer of it adding to the one beneath until the air itself seems to thicken. One of the younger Reapers, a man near the back of the group with a blonde beard and an unlit cigarette in his hand, stopped mid-laugh. He turned his head. That small motion, one man turning his head, traveled through the group like a current. Hunter Voss noticed the laughter drying up. He turned too. The first 4 bikes crested the highway exit ramp at the same moment, side by side, descending in tight formation with the mechanical gravity of something rehearsed 10,000 times until rehearsal became instinct. The afternoon sun hit their headlights square and threw shafts of white light across the lot before the bikes had crossed the property line. Behind those 4 came 4 more, and behind those came 4 more still, and the sound by now had left the category of sound entirely and entered the category of event, a deep, synchronized percussion that filled the chest and reset the heartbeat to its rhythm. Iron Brotherhood colors were visible at 200 yards. Every back in that formation wore them. Every jacket, every vest, every rider in that double column was unified in a way that 23 Reapers spread across a gas station lot, loose and self-important, were not and had never been. Several Harlan Reapers stepped backward without being instructed to. They did not look at Hunter Voss before they did it. They simply moved, the body making the calculation faster than the ego could intervene. Jerome Tate came in first. He was broad in the shoulder and steady in every movement, a man who carried his size without announcement, the way a mountain carries its elevation. He pulled his bike, a black and chrome Harley, with Iron Brotherhood national colors and a vice president's patch that caught the canopy light like a credential, directly into the lot, crossed the painted lanes without slowing, and stopped 10 feet from Hunter Voss's position. He cut his engine. The silence that followed that single engine cutting was somehow louder than the engine had been. He set both hands on his knees and looked at Hunter Voss the way a man looks at something he is cataloging, rather than confronting. He said nothing. Then the 39 came. They filled the lot in under 90 seconds. This was not an accident, and it was not improvised. Winston Gable's radio communications over the past 16 minutes had been precise. Lane assignments, parking sequence, spacing intervals, timing, because the Iron Brotherhood Veterans MC did not arrive anywhere without structure. These were men who had held formations under conditions that made a rural Kentucky gas station look like a church social, and it showed in every measured interval between bikes, every engine cut in sequence, every rider who dismounted and stood without speaking, waiting. The canopy overhead, with its long rows of overhead fluorescent tubes burning white and cool in the afternoon heat, now had company. 40 headlights pointed inward. The lot was lit from every angle. There were no shadows left. Rochelle Moss, behind the window, pressed one hand flat to the glass. Gerald Whitman, at the far pump, where he had stood motionless and watchful for the better part of 20 minutes, exhaled for what felt like the first time since the Reapers had formed their circle. He did not move. He watched the same way a man watches the resolution of something he had not known was a story until he found himself in the middle of it. The Harlan Reapers circle, the shoulder-to-shoulder semicircle that had compressed Daniel Marsh against Pump 3 with the practiced geometry of men accustomed to intimidation, had ceased to exist. It had not been broken. It had dissolved. Some men stepped back toward their own bikes. Some drifted left or right without destination, the body seeking distance from the center of a situation that had reclassified itself without warning. Some stood frozen in the positions they had occupied for the last 20 minutes, unable to move in any direction, because every direction now led towards something they had not prepared for. Hunter Voss had not moved. This was either courage or paralysis, and from where Daniel Marsh was standing, it did not much matter which. Winston Gable dismounted from a position near the rear of the formation. He was not in a hurry. He crossed the lot at an even pace, passing between two Reapers who stepped sideways to clear his path without being asked, navigating around a Reaper bike parked crookedly near the air pump, and he walked directly to the Kawasaki that had been moved. He gripped the handlebars, checked the balance, and wheeled it calmly back to Pump 3. He positioned it precisely where it had been, as if the concrete itself remembered the tire marks, and set the kickstand down. Then he stepped away from the bike without making eye contact with anyone and returned to his own position in the formation. He had not spoken a word. That act, quiet and deliberate and impossible to misread, landed in the lot the way a gavel lands, not with noise, but with finality. Something had been said without language, and every person in that lot, Reaper and Brotherhood and cashier and retired lawman and the young woman near the edge of the circle with her phone no longer raised for recording, every one of them heard it. Daniel Marsh looked at his Kawasaki. He looked at the cracked mirror he had ridden with since his first tour, the one that sat at a slightly imperfect angle that he had never adjusted because some things you leave the way they are to remember where they came from. He put one hand on the handlebar grip and then let it rest there, not gripping, just resting. Trace Dunbar was standing 6 feet to Hunter Voss's left. His right hand moved toward the front of his vest pocket, a small motion, nearly involuntary, the hand of a man whose anxiety was looking for something to hold. Jerome Tate saw it. He had been watching Trace Dunbar since the moment he cut his engine, because Jerome Tate had spent years reading rooms, and this was a room that required reading. He turned his eyes to Trace Dunbar and shook his head once, slowly. No urgency in it, no threat in the conventional sense, just a single, measured shake of the head that communicated everything necessary in the space of 1 second. Trace Dunbar's hand dropped to his side. He looked at the ground. Hunter Voss turned to his crew. What he found was not a crew. What he found were 23 individual men in various stages of personal reassessment, scattered across a lot that no longer belonged to any version of Harlan County he recognized, standing in the collective light of 40 headlights and every overhead fluorescent tube that the gas station canopy could produce, under open afternoon sky, with the sun pressing down clean and indifferent on all of it. Not one of them was looking at him for direction. Daniel Marsh reached into the inside pocket of his vest and removed his phone. He looked at the screen for a moment, not to send a message, because the message had already been sent and received and answered with 40 engines and 90 seconds, and one man walking a bike back to its rightful place. He put the phone away. He straightened his vest. He looked at the highway exit, where 42 machines now idled or rested in formation, colors bright in the afternoon light, disciplined and present, and exactly what they had always been. A brotherhood of men who had earned every patch on their backs, in places and under conditions that Hunter Voss had never had the occasion to imagine. The sound of 40 engines at idle was different from the sound of their arrival. The arrival had been thunder. This was something quieter and more permanent. This was the sound of a thing that was not leaving, that had nowhere it needed to be except exactly here, that had all the time available to it in the world. Hunter Voss still had not moved. Daniel Marsh looked at him once, A brief, level look that carried no anger in it and required no words, and then looked away, toward the highway, toward the long road that stretched north and west into open country, toward the 1,000 miles of morning that were still waiting on the other side of Harlan County. He was not finished yet, but this part was. The gas station lot had gone quiet, in the way that only happens when a large group of people simultaneously understand that something has shifted and cannot be shifted back. 40 motorcycles sat in disciplined rows beneath the afternoon sun and the flat white blaze of the canopy fluorescence, their engines ticking as they cooled, their colors visible from every angle of the lot. The Iron Brotherhood Veterans MC occupied that space the way a fact occupies an argument, completely and without apology. Jerome Tate walked to Daniel Marsh's side. He was broad-shouldered and unhurried, his orange Henley pressed clean beneath a dark blue jacket, his riding boots scraping lightly against the cracked concrete. He had ridden point position for the last 40 miles, and there was no fatigue in his posture. He stopped at Daniel Marsh's left shoulder and looked at him, and Daniel Marsh looked back, and in the full overhead light of that canopy, with 23 Harlan Reapers standing in various states of stillness around them, the two men exchanged something that required no translation. It was the look of men who had stood in worse places together and had come out the other side carrying the same values they'd carried going in. It lasted 2 seconds. That was enough. Then Jerome Tate turned and faced Hunter Voss. Hunter Voss had not moved far. He stood near the pump where he'd been performing his confidence for the last 20 minutes, still in his black leather vest and white long-sleeve shirt, still in his dark cargo pants and heavy boots, but everything about the performance had drained out of him. He stood now the way a building stands after the interior framework has been removed, upright by habit, hollow by fact. Jerome Tate let the silence hold for a moment. He looked at the patch on Daniel Marsh's vest. He read it aloud. Iron Brotherhood Veterans Motorcycle Club. His voice was measured, not raised. Under the fluorescent canopy lights, every syllable landed clean and level on the afternoon air. National Chapter. Founded 1987. He paused. Several of the Reapers were watching him now, instead of their president. That was a detail worth noticing, and Jerome Tate noticed it, and he continued, National President. Another pause, longer this time. He let the title sit in the air above Hunter Voss's head like a fact, waiting to be accepted. Daniel Marsh. Hunter Voss's jaw moved slightly. He said nothing. Jerome Tate had not looked at any notes. He had not needed to. He continued in the same measured, unhurried voice. The voice of a man who had prepared nothing because he had known everything for years. 3 combat tours, United States Army, 2 letters of commendation. He turned his head just enough to let his eyes pass across the 23 men who had laughed 30 minutes ago when Hunter Voss poured a cup of coffee onto the ground in front of this man. Bronze Star. Awarded for actions under fire during his 2nd deployment. The words Bronze Star hit the concrete and spread the way the coffee had spread, outward, soaking into the silence, going further than expected. One Reaper near the back of the loose cluster looked down at his boots. Another turned his face toward the highway exit, as though he had just remembered somewhere he needed to be. Petra Voss, still standing near the edge of what had once been a circle and was now simply an open lot, was still holding her phone up. The screen was still recording. Her expression was not the expression of someone capturing a victory. It was the expression of someone watching a photograph develop in a dark room and slowly understanding that the image is not what they had assumed. Jerome Tate had not finished. The Iron Brotherhood Veterans MC was founded by black veterans who came home from service and found no seat waiting for them. They built their own table. 37 years later, that table has chapters in 16 states and 412 members, every one of them with a service record. He let that number land without emphasis because it needed none. The man you surrounded at that pump helped build every chapter of it. Hunter Voss's expression had shifted. It had not shifted to remorse. Remorse would have required a kind of inner architecture that Hunter Voss had never bothered to construct. What his face showed instead was the specific blankness of a man running calculations, measuring distances between what had just been said and every person present who had heard it said, estimating the size of the problem, trying to locate an exit that no longer existed. His eyes moved across his crew and did not find what he was looking for. His crew was not looking back at him the way it had looked at him 40 minutes ago, when he'd poured out that coffee and 23 men had grinned and leaned in and fed off the energy of his contempt. That energy was gone. In its place was something more uncomfortable and less manageable. The specific discomfort of men who have watched themselves be wrong in public and cannot yet decide what to do about it. Trace Dunbar stood 4 feet to Hunter Voss's right. He had not moved toward his president. He had not moved away. He was standing very still with his eyes directed at the middle distance, not at Hunter Voss, not at Daniel Marsh, not at Jerome Tate. He had chosen the one direction that required nothing of him, and everyone in the lot who was paying attention understood what that choice meant. Trace Dunbar was calculating his own position now, not his president's. That was a seismic shift dressed up as stillness. Rochelle Moss had come outside. She had not made an announcement about it. She had come through the glass door of the station and positioned herself near the entrance, and she stood there now with her arms folded across the front of her orange polo shirt, her dark slacks pressed clean, her expression the expression of a woman who has been watching from behind glass for long enough and has decided that standing in the open air means something, even if no one asks her to explain what. She had spent the last 20 minutes behind that window, watching a man be surrounded and mocked, watching his coffee get poured out at his feet, watching Hunter Voss perform cruelty the way some men perform generosity, publicly, with an audience, for the pleasure of the response. She had made her call quietly, without being seen, and she had gone back to the register and waited. Now the moment had changed, and she had walked out into it, and the walking out was its own small declaration. It cost something to stand outside, in a lot full of men whose president had just been publicly reduced, and Rochelle Moss had decided to spend that cost without being asked. Gerald Whitman had moved too. He had closed the distance from the far pump to within earshot, his hands settled in the pockets of his blue jacket, his face neutral in the practiced way of a man who spent decades reading volatile situations and learned that visible emotion rarely helps them. He was 68 years old, and he had seen the Reapers work a dozen variations of this same scene across 11 years and 3 different county lines. He had watched it, and he had made his call, and now he stood close enough to hear Jerome Tate's voice clearly. And there was something settled in his posture that had nothing to do with comfort and everything to do with certainty. Daniel Marsh had said nothing. He stood beside Pump 3, where his Kawasaki had been returned, where the oil-dark stain of his spilled coffee was still visible on the cracked concrete near his boot. He had said nothing since Jerome Tate began speaking. He had not needed to. Jerome Tate was not speaking for Daniel Marsh's benefit. Daniel Marsh already knew every line of his own record. He had lived every line of it, in places where the temperature hit 115 degrees, and the choices were worse than any choice available in a gas station lot in Harlan County on a Tuesday afternoon. Jerome Tate was speaking for the benefit of everyone else present, for the 23 men who had laughed, for the woman recording on her phone, for the retired sheriff with his hands in his jacket pockets, for the cashier standing at the door with her arms folded, for anyone within the range of a clear voice under a canopy full of overhead light. He was reading the record into the daylight where it could not be taken back. Hunter Voss looked across his crew one more time. The look came back empty in the specific way that a leader's look comes back empty when he has already lost the thing that made him a leader, the belief of the people standing nearest to him that he is the most powerful person in the room. That belief had not been taken from him by a fight. It had not been taken by a threat. It had dissolved quietly in the middle of Jerome Tate's steady voice, receding like water pulling back from a shoreline, and the ground it left behind was different ground than the ground that had been there before. Several Reapers had drifted to the edges of the lot in ones and twos. Not running, just repositioning in the way that men reposition when they want to be associated with something other than where they are standing. The group identity that Hunter Voss had maintained through 11 years of claimed territory and accumulated menace was revealing itself for what it had always been, not a brotherhood, but an audience. And audiences disperse when the performance stops being entertaining. Jerome Tate looked at Hunter Voss one final time, without any particular feeling in his expression. Then he turned back to Daniel Marsh. Daniel Marsh nodded once. Not a nod of gratitude, not a nod of celebration, a nod of acknowledgement between two men who understood the weight of the same things, who had carried that weight through the same years, who needed no ceremony to confirm what they already knew about each other and themselves. The afternoon sun held everything in clear, honest light. The fluorescent canopy hummed above it all. 40 sets of Iron Brotherhood colors caught that light and gave it back. Hunter Voss stood at his pump and said nothing, and the silence that surrounded him now was a different kind of silence than the silence that had surrounded Daniel Marsh an hour ago. Daniel Marsh's silence had been a choice. Hunter Voss's silence was all that was left. Nobody announced her arrival. That was the first thing Daniel Marsh noticed about Captain Simone Hale. No lights, no siren, no performance of authority rolling in to announce itself from 2 blocks away. Just a state patrol vehicle turning off the county road with the quiet, measured momentum of someone who had all the time in the world and knew it. The afternoon sun sat high and direct over the gas station canopy, the overhead fluorescent lights burning their flat white against the concrete below, and the patrol car moved through all of that illumination, without hurry, without theater, easing into the far end of the lot, the way a period settles at the end of a long sentence. Daniel watched her park. He had the fresh cup of coffee in his right hand, the one Rochelle Moss had carried out through the glass door 7 minutes ago without being asked, setting it on the pump housing beside him with a small, firm nod before folding her arms and staying put near the entrance, close enough to see everything, far enough to give the moment its space. The coffee was hot. He'd let it cool 1 degree before lifting it, just as he always did, a habit so old it lived in his hands before it lived in his mind. Captain Simone Hale stepped out of the vehicle in a short-sleeve uniform, pressed to a standard that suggested she pressed it herself and meant every crease. Sunglasses on, dark, professional, unhurried in the specific way that people who carry real authority learn to move. Not slow, not fast, simply deliberate, each step placed where it was intended. She was maybe 40, with the posture of someone who had passed through difficult rooms and chosen not to shrink in any of them. She did not sweep the lot dramatically. She read it the way you read a document you've reviewed before, quickly, thoroughly, already knowing what the important parts were going to say. Gerald Whitman was standing near his pickup at the far pump, blue jacket over his plain clothes, hands loose at his sides. When Captain Hale's eyes found him, he gave one small nod and she returned it. That was the entirety of their greeting. 2 people who knew each other, confirming what they both already understood about why she was here. She walked toward Hunter Voss's bike. She did not walk toward Hunter Voss. She walked toward his machine, the Harlan Reapers president's bike, parked at the edge of the semicircle that was no longer a semicircle. The crew that had filled it now scattered and reconfigured into something without a name, men standing in ones and twos in postures that all read, with only minor variations, as the same calculation. What is my specific exposure here? And how far from the center of this thing do I need to stand? She keyed something into the handheld unit on her belt. Read what came back. Keyed something else. Read again. It took approximately 45 seconds. Hunter Voss watched her from 8 feet away, and the thing that had been living in his face since the 40 bikes rolled under the canopy, that specific blankness, the face of a man whose operating system is still running, but whose screen has gone dark, shifted into something slightly different, something that was aware, something that was beginning to understand the shape of what was coming before it arrived. Captain Hale walked over to him without drama. She spoke quietly enough that the exact words didn't carry to the outer edges of the lot. She didn't need volume. She had the document. She held the handheld unit at a slight angle so Hunter Voss could read the screen if he chose to, and she read it to him anyway, line by line, not unkindly, the way a doctor reads a diagnosis to a patient who already knows what it says and just needs to hear it confirmed aloud. 2 outstanding warrants, adjacent counties, assault charges, both of them, deferred twice each through the specific machinery of local connections. A cousin who knew a clerk, a previous sheriff who owed a favor. The kind of machinery that functions inside one county line and stops functioning the moment a state jurisdiction picks up the case instead. State jurisdiction had picked up the case. Daniel heard none of the specific words. He didn't need them. He read the scene in the way he'd learned to read terrain, not detail by detail, but all at once, the whole picture, settling into meaning before any single element of it was fully processed. He lifted the coffee cup and took a slow sip, and watched Hunter Voss receive the information about his own life from a woman he could not intimidate, could not circle, could not pour a cup of coffee on and laugh about after. The quiet was more damaging than a scene would have been. A scene would have given Hunter Voss something to push against. A scene would have had edges he could grab. This had no edges. This was administrative. This was procedure. This was the specific coldness of a system that does not raise its voice because it doesn't need to. Trace Dunbar took 2 physical steps backward, not a drift, not a shuffle. 2 actual, committed, deliberate steps, the kind of movement the body makes when the mind has completed a calculation and arrived at a number it doesn't like. He did not look at Hunter Voss when he did it. He looked at the ground, then at his own boots, then at the middle distance somewhere between himself and the state patrol vehicle, and the 2 steps simply happened, clear and precise as punctuation. 3 men near him watched it happen. None of them moved back toward Hunter Voss. 2 of them looked away. Petra Voss had her phone out of her pocket and in her hand, but she had stopped recording some time ago. Exactly when was hard to pinpoint. Somewhere in the minutes after Jerome Tate had finished reading Daniel Marsh's service record aloud in the flat canopy light, the words landing in the lot like physical objects that couldn't be unplaced. She stood at the edge of what had been the circle, yellow jacket bright in the afternoon sun, dark jeans, and her face carried an expression that wasn't readable as a single emotion. It was the face of someone sorting through several feelings simultaneously and not yet done with the process. She pocketed the phone. She didn't look at her brother. She looked at the patrol car, at Captain Hale, at the ground, and then out at the highway, where the view from this lot extended far enough that you could see a long way in both directions before the road bent out of sight. Rochelle Moss had not moved from near the entrance. Arms folded, weight settled, orange polo shirt bright in the canopy light, watching the whole lot with the patience of a woman who had seen what people were capable of and had decided a long time ago not to pretend otherwise. She had made a call. She had carried out coffee. She had not gone back inside. These were not small decisions. Daniel understood that. He'd seen the particular courage of witnesses before, the people who stay present when presence costs something, and he recognized it now in the way she stood. Not performatively, not righteously, just there, solid and human and unwilling to look away. Hunter Voss said something to Captain Hale. She listened to it. Then she said something back, the same measured tone, and showed him the screen again. Whatever he'd said hadn't changed anything. It hadn't been expected to. The warrants existed in 2 counties in a database that didn't care about local connections or 11 years of running a particular stretch of highway, that didn't know who his cousin's friend was or what favor which sheriff had owed to which man. The database just had names and dates and charges, and the notation that both cases remained open and unresolved, waiting for the moment they became someone's jurisdiction. This was that moment. Daniel Marsh watched a man discover that the world he believed himself to control was always smaller than he had measured it. The discovery didn't look like revelation. It looked like a slow depressurization, something behind the eyes going flat, the posture that had spent 11 years telling everyone in arm's reach how things worked in Harlan County, settling into something that was just a body in a parking lot. One body among many, subject to the same data, the same records, the same outstanding warrants as anyone else who had ever thought geography was the same thing as immunity. He had poured out a man's coffee this afternoon because he believed in the absolute reality of his own untouchable dominion over every square foot of asphalt in this county. He had surrounded a man with 23 riders because he believed numbers were permanent and power was a thing that could be owned. He had moved a man's motorcycle to demonstrate that objects like people obeyed him when he required it. And now he was standing in his own lot, in front of his own crew, reading a screen that said his name in a jurisdiction that had never been introduced to his cousin. Daniel did not gloat. He didn't feel the pull of it. What he felt was something quieter and more complete, a deep, settled stillness that had been present in him for the entire afternoon, but now had a different quality, the way a held breath has a different quality once it's released. The silence in this chapter of the afternoon was the same kind of silence he'd observed since the first moment Hunter Voss poured out his coffee and waited for fear. But it meant something entirely different now. Then it was patience. Now it was conclusion. He lifted the coffee cup again, let the warmth come through the paper into his palm, watched Captain Hale complete the process that Gerald Whitman's call had set in motion. Not a cavalry, not a rescue, just procedure arriving at the pace and shape of procedure, quiet and comprehensive and without mercy, in the specific way that accountability is without mercy when it finally reaches the man who believed he'd outrun it. The crew that had laughed at Hunter Voss's jokes was calculating its own exposure, one by one, in the scattered geometry of former certainty. Trace Dunbar had found a place to stand that was technically near the bikes, without being near the man. Voss was still looking at the highway. Daniel Marsh held his coffee and let the afternoon finish its work. He had not raised his voice once today. He didn't need to. That was the part Hunter Voss had never understood. The part a man like Hunter Voss could never understand, because the understanding required having been the kind of man Daniel Marsh was, the kind who learned early and at significant cost that restraint was not absence, that stillness was not weakness, that the most devastating thing a person could do in the face of someone demanding your fear was simply to decline to give it. Captain Hale had her notepad out now. Daniel looked at his watch. He had 1,000 miles of highway ahead of him. Daniel Marsh took the last sip slowly, not because the coffee was exceptional. Rochelle Moss had pressed it into his hands from behind the station counter 10 minutes ago. A fresh cup in a clean paper sleeve, her eyes saying everything her mouth didn't need to. But because Daniel Marsh had learned a long time ago to finish what you started. You finished the mission. You finished the march. You finished the coffee. You did not let the world rush you out of a single moment that was rightfully yours. The afternoon sun came down clean and direct through the open canopy, flooding Pump 3 in that flat, honest white light that leaves no room for shadows to hide. The fluorescent overheads hummed quietly above him. The gas station lot was a different geography from the one Hunter Voss had tried to draw an hour ago. That map, the one where 23 leather vests formed a tight circle and the rules of the county were written in smirks and spilled coffee. That map was gone. What stood in its place was the plain, undecorated truth of the situation. Captain Simone Hale stood 15 yards away near her state patrol vehicle, short-sleeve uniform crisp in the afternoon heat, her voice professionally level as she walked Hunter Voss through the warrant paperwork. She was not rushing. She did not need to rush. The warrants from 2 adjacent counties were not complicated documents. They were simply the written record of a man who had spent years believing that local connections were the same thing as immunity. They were not. Hunter Voss stood with his back slightly turned from his own crew, which was its own kind of answer. His black leather vest over the white long-sleeve shirt that had looked like authority 6 chapters ago now looked like a costume whose production had closed. His shoulders had dropped 2 inches since Jerome Tate had read Daniel Marsh's record aloud in the daylight. Some things, once said in the open air in front of witnesses, could not be unsaid. Jerome Tate had known exactly that when he said them. The Reapers were scattered. That was the only word that fit. 6 of them stood near their bikes at the far edge of the lot, speaking in low voices that carried no energy. 3 others had already mounted and sat with engines cold, waiting for a signal that was not going to come from the direction they were used to looking. Trace Dunbar stood alone beside a concrete pillar at the lot's edge, hands in his cargo pockets, his eyes on the asphalt. He had not looked at Hunter Voss in 12 minutes. Petra Voss sat on the curb near the air pump in her yellow jacket and dark jeans, her phone face down on the concrete beside her. Her expression the particular kind of blank that comes after you've watched something you can't unknow. Daniel Marsh set the empty cup on the pump ledge. He did not drop it. He placed it with the same deliberate care he gave everything. The kind of care that was not performance but habit. The residue of a life that had demanded precision in the moments when precision was the only thing between order and chaos. He walked to his Kawasaki. The bike was where Winston Gable had returned it. Pump 3, exactly where Daniel Marsh had been standing when Hunter Voss poured the first cup of coffee onto the cracked concrete. That felt right to him. Full circle was not a metaphor. It was a description of how justice actually moved. When it moved, not in straight lines, not in dramatic arcs, but in slow, patient rotations that brought everything back to the original point. He ran one hand along the left mirror. The scratched chrome caught the overhead light and threw it back in broken angles. This mirror had been with him since Kandahar, which meant it had been with him for longer than some of his brothers had been alive. It was cracked at the mount and had been resecured with a hardware bolt he'd replaced himself at a roadside shop in eastern Tennessee 7 years ago. He had never replaced the mirror itself. He was not sentimental about many things, but he was honest with himself about the ones he was sentimental about, and this was one of them. He put on his helmet. 40 feet behind him, Jerome Tate swung a broad leg over his bike, settled his weight, and looked straight ahead. His green top was bright in the afternoon sun, visible across the lot like a signal flag. Winston Gable, 2 bikes over, pulled on his gloves with the methodical efficiency of a man who had ridden more miles than he could calculate and intended to ride that many again. Then the ignitions began, not all at once, in sequence, the way they always did it, the way Winston Gable had drilled into the formation 3 cross-country runs ago because a staggered ignition sequence sounded like intention. And the Iron Brotherhood Veterans MC was an organization that intended everything it did. 42 engines turning over one after another, each adding its voice to the growing sound, until the gas station lot was filled with something that was not noise so much as presence. The sound rolled out from under the canopy and spread onto the highway approach and carried down the county road in both directions. Gerald Whitman, standing at the far end of the lot with his truck keys in his hand, and his blue jacket buttoned against the afternoon breeze, watched the ignition sequence complete. He had seen a lot in 31 years wearing a county sheriff's badge, and a good deal more in the 7 years since he'd taken it off. He knew what discipline looked like, and he knew what the absence of it looked like, and he had known the difference between those two things the moment he pulled into this gas station and saw a single man standing quietly in a circle of 23. He nodded at nothing in particular. Then he got in his truck. Daniel Marsh eased the Kawasaki forward. He rolled through the lot at low speed, past the scattered remnants of the Harlan Reapers, past Captain Hale's patrol vehicle, where she was still working methodically through Hunter Voss's situation, past the pump where his coffee had been poured out on the concrete hours earlier. The concrete was dry now. The afternoon heat had taken care of that. There was no mark left. At the lot exit, he stopped. Rochelle Moss was standing in the station doorway. Orange polo tucked into black slacks, arms no longer folded the way they had been when she came outside to watch. Now they were at her sides, and she was watching him with the specific attention of a person who understood the weight of what she'd done by picking up that phone and making that call. It had not been a safe thing to do. In Harlan County, with the Reapers in the lot, and 23 pairs of eyes that might have turned toward the window at any moment, it had been the opposite of safe. She had done it anyway. Daniel Marsh raised his left hand. It was not a wave. A wave was casual, was goodbye, was the gesture you gave someone you'd see again at the diner next week. This was something slower. His hand came up, palm open, and held still for 3 full seconds in the afternoon light. It was the acknowledgement you gave to someone who had stood up when standing up cost something. It was the gesture of a man who had spent his life surrounded by people who understood that kind of courage and knew how rarely civilians were called to find it in themselves and how much it deserved to be seen when they did. Rochelle Moss nodded once. Chin down, chin up, straight and clear. Daniel Marsh turned onto the highway. 41 bikes followed him out in column, merging onto the open road in the same disciplined formation they had carried for 600 miles already and would carry for 1,000 more. The afternoon sun came through clean from the west, laying long gold light across the highway ahead and catching the Iron Brotherhood colors on every back. The patches, the veteran pins, the flags and insignia of men who had served a country that had not always made room for them when they came home, and who had made their own room regardless. The road opened ahead of him, wide and flat, and without a border in sight. Daniel Marsh had ridden roads that went through mountains, through desert, through river valleys and flatlands that stretched to every horizon. He had ridden them in heat and in cold, in wind and in rain, with brothers and once or twice alone. What he knew, with the certainty of a man who had earned it mile by mile, was that no stretch of asphalt on this earth belonged to the man with the loudest voice or the most leather at his back. The road belonged to anyone with the will to ride it. That was the whole of the law, as far as he was concerned. The formation grew smaller against the open sky. 42 bikes in perfect column, colors catching the daylight, moving west on a highway that had no walls and no borders and no memory of the man who had once stood at its edge and tried to make it smaller than it was. Behind them, a patrol car sat in a gas station lot. Ahead of them, 1,000 miles of open road ran uninterrupted toward everything that was still worth riding toward. Daniel Marsh rode. You just heard a story that history tried to overlook. If it stayed with you, take a second to stand with it. Subscribe, share, and help us keep telling the stories that deserve light, not silence.